The police dog refused to leave the mysterious container, barking and snarling with an intensity the officers had never witnessed. Days passed as authorities tried to understand the trained animal's unusual behavior, until the discovery inside that metal space revealed a scene that left even the most seasoned investigators in a state of shock. Fog hung heavy over the Port of Santos as Daniel Brotas adjusted his bulletproof vest, preparing for another night patrol. The biting July cold gnawed at his fingers as he jotted down incidents in his notepad. For the third dawn in a row, the officer spotted the same motionless figure among the giant containers lined up on the quay. A German shepherd with a thick coat, sitting like a statue before container BZX4179. "Hey boy," Daniel called, approaching with slow steps. He expected the animal to flee, or at the very least, bare its teeth, as the stray dogs that frequently roamed the port did. But the German shepherd merely turned its head, fixing him with a penetrating, serene gaze before returning its attention to the container. The officer tried to offer a piece of the sandwich he carried in his pack. "Come on, you must be hungry." But the dog completely ignored the food, remaining at its post like a sentinel. Daniel circled the container, noting that nothing seemed out of the ordinary. There were no suspicious marks, no signs of a break-in. Just a stubborn dog that, for some incomprehensible reason, refused to leave that specific spot. "You got a name, buddy?" he asked, noticing the absence of a collar. The animal, which would later be known as Rex, didn't move a single inch. Stories of abandoned dogs were common among the workers at the Port of Santos. Some said they were left behind by crews from foreign ships. Others believed they came from the nearby hills in search of food. But there was something different about this particular animal. "He doesn't look hungry," Daniel thought, observing its relatively well-cared-for coat. Nor did he seem frightened. The dog displayed an almost human determination, as if fulfilling a mission. The officer memorized the container's code, BZXU4, and made a mental note to check its contents and destination in the port's system during his next shift. Something about the animal's behavior piqued his professional curiosity. As he resumed his patrol, Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the pre-dawn cold. An inexplicable unease settled over him, as if this silent encounter were the prelude to something much larger. In 15 years of patrolling the port, he had never experienced a similar feeling. "I'll be back to see you tomorrow, boy," he murmured, casting one last look at the German shepherd, who remained impassive, the silent guardian of a mystery that Daniel Brotas could not yet comprehend, but which would soon be revealed. Over the next 3 days, Daniel Brotas closely observed the German shepherd's behavior. The dog remained faithfully posted before container BZXU4179, a tireless sentry. Even when summer storms battered the Port of Santos with torrential rains, the animal did not abandon its post. The piercing whistles of the tugboats, which normally startled even the bravest dogs on the docks, only made Rex flinch momentarily, but never drove him away from that specific spot. One morning, Daniel brought a piece of meat and placed it a few meters from the container. The dog looked at the food, then at the officer, but didn't move. Only when Daniel walked away did Rex quickly snatch the food and return to his original position, as if fearing something might happen during his brief absence. "Never seen such a stubborn mutt," commented a passing stevedore, adjusting his helmet. "He's not a mutt, he's a German shepherd," Daniel corrected, noting the animal's well-defined features beneath the grime caked on its fur. In the shift break room, as port workers traded stories about unusual shipments, The officer shared his observations with Sergeant Rivas. His superior listened attentively while stirring her coffee with a plastic spoon, her ID badge dangling from her impeccably pressed uniform. He probably found shelter in there, Daniel. Dogs are wary animals, but he'll get bored eventually, she replied with a skeptical smile, shrugging. Last week we had a cat that wouldn't come down from that old crane, remember? Then it just disappeared. Daniel nodded, but his gut told him this was different. It wasn't just the animal's persistence that intrigued him, but the way it watched that specific container, as if guarding a secret. I'm going to check the records for this container, he mentioned, finishing his coffee. Don't waste your time, the sergeant warned. We have 3 ships arriving today, and the team is short-handed. That night, passing the spot again on his patrol, Daniel found Seu Tonico, the elderly port worker who knew every corner of the port like the back of his hand. This dog's been here for days, hasn't he? The old man commented, leaning on his broom. In my day, we learned to pay attention to these signs. Animals sense things people can't see. Daniel looked at Rex, who kept his eyes fixed on the container, alert to every movement around him. The officer could no longer ignore the growing feeling that there was more to this story than simple animal stubbornness. Something was wrong, and this dog seemed to be the only one who knew exactly what it was. One night, as the sea breeze carried the characteristic scent of salt and rust from the port, Daniel Brotas made his usual patrol through the container sector. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the distant sound of waves and the occasional metallic creak of the structures. As he passed container BZXU4179, where Rex kept his tireless vigil, the officer slowed his pace. The German shepherd, lying down but as alert as ever, pricked up his ears. It was then that Daniel heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like nails scratching against metal. The officer froze, holding his breath to listen better. Rex seemed to have noticed it too, for he stood up, approaching the container door with his snout raised. "Is anyone there?" Daniel whispered, approaching cautiously. The sound stopped immediately. The dog looked at him with those intense eyes, as if confirming his suspicions. Daniel waited a few more minutes, but silence reigned once more. Reluctantly, he completed his rounds, but the unease did not leave him for the rest of his shift. The next morning, after a sleepless night filled with disturbing thoughts, the officer made a decision. Before starting his shift, he went home and picked up a small recorder he had kept since his academy days. It wasn't sophisticated equipment, but it would serve his purpose. "If I'm going crazy, at least I'll have proof," he muttered to himself as he walked along the quay. When he reached the container, Rex was already there, as always. The animal recognized Daniel immediately, allowing him to get close. Carefully, the officer positioned the device near a small crack in the door of BZXU4179, camouflaging it with a piece of dark cloth. "Let's see if you're really protecting something, buddy," he said quietly, stroking the German shepherd's head. 6 hours later, at the end of his shift, Daniel retrieved the recorder. Anxiety consumed him on his way home. Locked in his room, he connected the device to his computer and started the playback. For the first 20 minutes, there were only the ambient sounds of the port. Then, the sound of footsteps, likely workers passing by. And then, about halfway through the recording, he heard it. Taps. Faint, spaced, and rhythmic. 3 in a row. A pause. Then 2 more. Then silence. Minutes later, the pattern repeated. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't the wind or rats. It was a deliberate pattern, almost like a code. Something, or someone, was inside that container, trying to communicate. In that moment, all the officer's suspicions were confirmed. Rex's behavior, the new lock, the suspicious activity. It all made sense now. There was life inside that metal box, and it desperately needed help. Daniel circled container BZXU4179 again, while Rex watched his every move. The officer crouched down to examine the padlock sealing the door and noticed something strange. Unlike all the other security devices in the port, this one gleamed as if it had been recently placed. There were no traces of the rust or saltpeter that normally corroded metal exposed to the sea air. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, photographing the lock with his phone. The other containers, even newly arrived ones, already showed signs of oxidation from the constant humidity. The next day, the officer decided to check the official port records. Sitting in front of the control room computer, Daniel typed the code BZXU4179 into the system. The screen displayed information that only heightened his anxiety. According to the documentation, the container should have been in the North Yard, awaiting shipment abroad, not on the quay where Rex stood his obstinate guard. Intrigued, the officer printed the documents and went to talk to Teutonico, who knew every inch of that port. "This container was moved without authorization. I'm sure of it," Daniel said, showing the papers to the old port worker. "Be careful, my boy," the old man replied in a low voice. "It's not the first time I've seen strange things around here. There are eyes and ears everywhere." Determined to share his findings, Daniel sought out Sergeant Rivas during the shift change. He presented the photos of the new padlock and the inconsistencies in the location records. "Brotas, you're obsessed with this dog and this container," his superior responded impatiently. "There was probably some administrative error. It happens all the time." "But Sergeant, this could indicate—" "Enough," Rivas interrupted. "We have robberies, trafficking, and other priority incidents. I can't waste resources because of a padlock and a stray dog." Frustrated, the officer tried to talk to other colleagues, but their reactions ranged from laughter to looks of pity. "Daniel's seeing things that aren't there," he heard one of them comment in the locker room. At the end of his shift, a sense of powerlessness washed over him as he drove home. The inconsistencies were piling up. The new lock, the incorrect location, Rex's inexplicable persistence. Something serious was happening, and Daniel seemed to be the only one willing to investigate. "Tomorrow I'll look for Teresa Valle," he decided, remembering the federal revenue agent who had previously shown interest in irregularities at the port. If no one else believed him, maybe she could help. On the morning of the 8th day, Daniel Brotas arrived at the Port of Santos for his shift and immediately sensed that something was different. His eyes scanned the key for container BZXU4179 in its usual spot, but it was gone. The officer's chest tightened. After a quick search, he found the container relocated to a more isolated area near the old warehouses, where foot traffic was almost non-existent. Rex, the German shepherd, was already there, as if he had followed the container during the night. The dog maintained its vigilant posture, lying a few meters from the metal door, its eyes alert to any movement. Daniel approached and briefly stroked the animal's head, which accepted the gesture without taking its eyes off the container. "Who authorized this move?" Daniel asked a passing forklift operator. The man shifted his eyes, avoiding contact. "Orders from the top. We just follow instructions," he answered hastily, moving away without giving Daniel a chance for more questions. The officer checked the movement log system on his tablet. There was no documentation, no official order for the transfer of BZXU4179. It violated every security protocol in the port. Daniel questioned other employees, but the answers followed the same pattern: vague, uncomfortable, and accompanied by gazes that wouldn't meet his. Strange, isn't it? Nobody knows anything when it matters, a hoarse voice said behind him. Daniel turned to find Seu Tonico, the elderly port worker who had been on the docks for over 4 decades. The gray-haired man leaned on a broom, observing the scene with eyes that seemed to have seen everything in that place. "Do you know anything about this?" Daniel asked, stepping closer. Seu Tonico glanced around before speaking, lowering his voice. "That dog showed up the same day as that container, you know? There's something wrong here, son." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. "What do you mean? I've never seen this dog around here before." The very day they unloaded that container, there he was, guarding it like he owned it. The old port worker adjusted his faded cap. And now they move the container in the middle of the night, with no record? In my day, that had a name. "What name?" Daniel asked. "Smuggling, or something worse." Seu Tonico leaned more heavily on his broom. "Be careful who you ask around here, kid. The port has ears in its walls." As the old man shuffled away, Daniel turned his gaze back to Rex, who continued his silent vigil. The coincidence pointed out by Seu Tonico could not be ignored. The officer took his phone from his pocket and discreetly photographed the container in its new location. Something was definitely wrong, and now he had a new lead. As the heavy dawn settled over the Port of Santos, Daniel Brotas decided to alter his patrol route. A strange compulsion had taken hold of Officer Daniel Brotas. At least twice a shift, he found himself drawn to container BZXU4179, moved by an unease he couldn't explain to his colleagues. As he neared the old warehouse district, Daniel noticed a vehicle parked deep in the shadows, a dark car he had never seen there before. Instinctively, his hand went to his sidearm as he advanced with caution. That's when he saw them. 2 silhouettes crouched by the container. The men, dressed in unmarked uniforms, were working on the gleaming padlock with tools that glinted in the faint light of the distant dock lamps. One whispered instructions while the other forced the lock. Suddenly, a shape exploded from the darkness. Rex, materializing as if from thin air, placed himself between the intruders and the metal door. The German shepherd stood rigid, the fur on his neck bristling, a low, continuous growl echoing in the night's silence as he bared his teeth. "Police! Freeze!" Daniel commanded, raising his service weapon. The intruders exchanged a fleeting glance. The taller one made a move toward the dog, but recoiled as Rex's growl intensified, his fangs now fully exposed. "Let's go!" one of them shouted, and they both sprinted for the car. Daniel gave chase but prioritized memorizing the license plate before it vanished into the gloom. He only managed to catch the first few digits before the sauce disappeared around the bend leading out of the port. When he returned to the container, Rex was back on guard, as if nothing had happened. The officer examined the padlock and saw the fresh marks of an attempted break-in. The next morning, in a cramped office that smelled of strong coffee, Daniel reported the incident to Sergeant Rivas. "Brotas, you're obsessed with that container," his superior sighed, not looking up from the papers she was signing. "They were probably just common thieves looking for something to steal." "With all due respect, Sergeant, common thieves don't wear uniforms or use specialized equipment," Daniel argued. And why that specific container? Rivas finally looked up, adjusting the glasses on her nose. Look, I don't want to hear any more about mysterious dogs and haunted shipping containers. You have real work to do. Don't go looking for trouble, Brotas. Leaving the office, Daniel ran into Tonico in the hallway. The old dock worker approached him discreetly. Heard there was some strange activity last night, the old man murmured. Be careful, son. Some big players have their eyes on that box. Rex's behavior had changed drastically in the last few days. The German shepherd, once merely watchful, now bared his teeth at anyone who came near container BXU4179. Daniel Brotas watched how the animal positioned himself strategically, as if guarding something precious inside that metal shell. After his last night patrol, the officer couldn't sleep. The evidence was piling up. The new padlock, the muffled sounds, the undocumented activity, and now the dog's aggression. Daniel knew he needed official help, someone with the authority to open that container without further delay. The following morning, he drove to the Federal Revenue Office at the port. Teresa Vale received him with a tired but attentive gaze. Daniel knew her from joint operations and was aware of her reputation. Years ago, Teresa had dismissed a tip that resulted in a shipment of counterfeit medicine getting through. 3 people had died. Since then, she left no stone unturned when suspicion arose. Teresa, I need your help, urgently, Daniel began, detailing his observations. The agent listened without interruption, jotting down quick notes. I'm going to need more than coincidences, Daniel, she said, adjusting her glasses. But I trust your gut, and that dog is trying to tell us something. That same afternoon, Teresa began the process for an emergency inspection. She filled out forms, attaching Daniel's reports and the inconsistencies in the container's documentation. The system was slow, bureaucratic, designed to prevent rash actions. I've managed to get it top priority, she explained over the phone. But even so, we need 48 hours to mobilize the right team. Daniel felt his stomach sink. 2 days could be too long. And there's more, Teresa continued, her voice low. I'm getting pushback internally. Some port officials are questioning the need for the inspection. The officer wasn't surprised. Fear of reprisal was common among the dock workers. Many depended on overtime and favors to supplement their income. No one wanted to cross the invisible bosses who controlled certain operations. Keep your eyes open, Teresa warned. If we're on to something big, they'll try to move that container before we can open it. Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. As he left her office, he spotted Tonico watching from a distance. The old dock worker simply gave a slight nod, a silent approval of a difficult decision. That night, returning to the container, Daniel found Rex even more agitated. Time was running out. On the 10th night of his vigil, the sky over Santos was shrouded in heavy clouds that hid the stars. Daniel Brotas made his solitary rounds through the port, with only the sound of waves crashing against the pier for company. As he approached container BZXU4179, he found Rex in the same vigilant post as always, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the metal structure. That's when he heard it. At first, it was a faint, rhythmic tapping, as if someone was using their last ounce of strength to communicate. Daniel held his breath, moving closer. What came next froze his blood. A child's voice, barely a whisper, asking for water in Portuguese. Is someone in there? The officer asked, pressing his ear to the container's cold surface. The tapping intensified for a moment, but Rex immediately moved between Daniel and the door, growling low. The German shepherd looked intently at the officer, then back at the container, as if begging for silence. Daniel understood. Any noise could frighten whoever was inside, or worse, alert those who had put them there. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone and activated the audio recorder. For 5 minutes, he captured the intermittent tapping and what sounded like more than one child's voice, murmuring indecipherable words. The officer's heart hammered against his ribs as the reality of what might be happening became terrifyingly clear. The next morning, Daniel didn't wait for his shift to end. He went straight to Sergeant Rivas's office, ignoring the curious stares of his colleagues. He found his superior filling out reports, her expression as stern as ever. "You need to listen to this. Now," he said, placing his phone on her desk. Rivas's expression slowly transformed as the audio played. Her usual skepticism gave way to concern, then to shock. She paused the recording several times, replaying sections as if searching for an alternative explanation. "You recorded this last night?" she finally asked, her voice lower than usual. "Yes. And Rex is still there, protecting that container like his life depends on it." The sergeant stood up, adjusting her holster. "I'm calling the Federal Revenue and requesting authorization for an immediate inspection. This can't wait any longer." Daniel felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Someone finally believed him. But what would they find inside that container? The audio evidence had broken through the wall of disbelief, but the full truth was still locked away, guarded by a dog who refused to abandon his post. Daniel Brotas entered the Port of Santos monitoring room with a sinking feeling. He asked the on-duty technician to check the recordings from the last few days in the area where container BZXU41979 was located. After a few minutes of searching, the discovery was disturbing. The footage simply stopped 2 days ago, exactly when the tapping had become more frequent. "What do you mean there's nothing?" he asked, his stomach tightening. The technician shrugged. "System fails sometimes. Could be a power outage or a server issue." But the officer knew it wasn't a coincidence. Analyzing the access logs, he noted that only that specific sector had been deactivated, while all other cameras had continued to function normally. Someone had deliberately sabotaged the surveillance system, and it had to be someone with privileged access and knowledge. Daniel spent the entire morning reviewing work schedules and security terminal entry logs. Cross-referencing data and times, one name began to stand out. Renato Merelle, a contract security guard who had been working at the port for 5 years. Discreetly, he asked Sergeant Rivas for information on Merelles. She hesitated before answering. "We've had issues with him before. He was investigated for petty theft and document tampering, but we could never find concrete proof." The officer noted Morell's shifts and saw a disturbing pattern. He had been on duty on every day there had been suspicious activity near the container. Furthermore, his badge had been used to access the monitoring room on the night the cameras stopped working. "He's not working alone," Daniel muttered to himself, connecting the dots. "There's a network operating in here, using the central computer." He checked Renato's background. The man had ties to shipping companies with international routes and had been mentioned in a closed human trafficking investigation, but the case was dropped for lack of evidence. Daniel held on to the information carefully. He was dealing with something much bigger and more dangerous than he had initially imagined. If Morelles discovered he was being investigated, he might alert his accomplices. Or worse, try to get rid of the evidence inside the container. Leaving the room, he saw Teresa Vale in the administrative hallway and gave her a discreet signal. The Federal Revenue agent understood immediately that he had found something important. They needed to act fast, but with extreme caution. Lives could be at stake. Daniel Brotas found a brown envelope in his locker when he arrived for his night shift. Inside, a handwritten note in a shaky script. "This has happened before. Be careful who's around." No signature. No clue as to who had left it. The officer looked around the empty locker room, the hair on his neck standing on end. During his patrol, he decided to find Toniko. The old dock worker was sitting on an empty crate, watching the cranes move as he smoked a cheap cigarette. When he saw Daniel approaching, he stubbed it out with a quick motion. "You got my note, then?" Toniko murmured, glancing from side to side before continuing. "Shouldn't have written anything, but at my age you start to worry about what you'll carry to the other side." "You know what's happening with that container, don't you?" Daniel asked, sitting beside the old man. Toniko sighed deeply. 3 years ago, they found a similar container. Had a dog watching it too. Nobody paid it any mind. By the time they finally opened it, there was nothing left but remains. The old man lowered his voice. They buried the story. Anyone who insisted on investigating got transferred or fired. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I've seen the way you look at that dog, Rex. Some people understand animals, and animals don't lie." Toniko adjusted his faded cap. "Kid, this port has secrets best left alone. But if you're going to stir things up, don't go it alone." As he walked back to continue his patrol, Daniel noticed a car parked in the shadows, 2 men watching him. He recognized one as a port administration employee, a man always present at meetings with Sergeant Rivas. That night, back at home, the officer couldn't sleep. The old man's words echoed in his mind, mixing with the image of Rex, motionless before the container. He thought of Teresa Vale, the agent who could help him, but he hesitated to involve her in something so potentially dangerous. Daniel sat at his kitchen table and wrote down everything he knew. He sealed the notes in an envelope and hid it beneath the lining of his sock drawer. The weight of responsibility grew with each passing hour, but something inside him, perhaps the same instinct that drove Rex, told him he couldn't back down. He looked out the window at the dark Santos night, where the port never slept. Tomorrow he would have to act, even if it meant defying the chain of command and risking his career. There were lives at stake. He could feel it. It was 3:40 in the morning when Daniel Brotas saw 2 figures moving furtively between the stacks of containers. The officer, who had decided to extend his patrol after his shift ended, immediately recognized their path. They were heading straight for BZXU4179. Rex, who now followed him constantly, sensed the tension in Daniel's body and remained completely silent. The officer signaled for the German Shepherd to stay low as they approached from the side of the container corridor. The men wore the uniforms of the third-party company that handled cargo movement at the port. One held a tool for cutting the padlock, while the other nervously watched their surroundings. "Let's just get this over with," the shorter one whispered. "If anyone shows up, we're screwed." Daniel waited for the exact moment they began to work on the lock. With a short whistle, he released Rex, who shot forward like a shadow, just as Daniel drew his service weapon. "Police! Freeze!" he shouted, shining his flashlight directly into their startled faces. One of them tried to run, but Rex was faster, taking him down with a precise leap at his legs. The other man, frozen in fear, dropped the tool he was holding. It clanged against the concrete floor. "Hands where I can see them," Daniel ordered, keying his radio to call for backup. In less than 15 minutes, a federal police vehicle arrived. The two men were identified as Rogerio Mendez and Paulo Gomez, both third-party logistics employees with access to various areas of the port. Later at the station, Daniel watched the suspects through the two-way mirror. Sergeant Rivas conducted the interrogation with calculated coldness, but the men remained silent, offering only the bare minimum. That's when Teresa Vale, from the Federal Revenue Service, asked to be left alone with Rogerio. After a few minutes, the man began to sweat. "Look, I was just following orders," he mumbled, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "They told me to check if anyone was still alive in there." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. "Who gave the orders?" Teresa pressed. Rogerio's voice dropped to a near inaudible whisper. "There are powerful people in this scheme. You shouldn't get involved." When they left the interrogation room, Daniel found Seu Tonico waiting in the hallway. The old port worker shook his head, his expression grave. "I warned you, kid. This goes much deeper than you can imagine." That night, returning home, Daniel noticed a dark vehicle parked across the street. As he approached the window for a better look, the car sped away. Rex, at his side, let out a low, continuous growl. The hunt had just begun. After 12 days of relentless persistence and meticulous paperwork, Daniel Brotas finally achieved what had seemed impossible: an official order to open container DZXU4179. The bureaucracy had been conquered thanks to the decisive support of Teresa Vale, who had mobilized her contacts to expedite the process. It was 5 in the morning when the small team gathered. Daniel arrived first, accompanied by Rex, who seemed more agitated than usual. Sergeant Rivas, initially skeptical, now commanded the operation with unwavering seriousness. 2 federal police agents, 3 revenue inspectors, and a specialized locksmith completed the group. "Are you sure about this, Brotas? If we find nothing, your career could end right here," Rivas whispered as they watched the final preparations. Daniel took a deep breath. The sleepless nights, the veiled threats, the suspicious glances from his colleagues, it all weighed on him. But Rex's behavior left no room for doubt. That dog knew something the humans had yet to discover. "I'm sure, Sergeant. I can't ignore what we saw and heard," he replied, running a hand through the German shepherd's fur. Teresa approached with the final documents. "It's all set. We can begin when you're ready." The locksmith stepped forward with his equipment, but paused at the sound of Rex's low growl. For a moment, everyone froze. The dog, however, showed no aggression, only a profound anxiety. Seu Tonico, who had insisted on being present, murmured, "He knows. That animal knows what's in there." When the first cut was made into the padlock, the silence was absolute, broken only by the sea wind and the distant creak of cranes. The second cut came faster, and the lock finally gave way. Rex positioned himself strategically beside the door, as if ready to protect someone or something inside. His watchful eyes never left the container's entrance. "Everyone back," the most experienced federal agent ordered. "We're opening it slowly." The metal door groaned heavily. A stale, unpleasant odor escaped through the opening. Daniel felt his heart pound. Rex, for the first time in days, barked loudly. Not a threat, but an announcement. The beams of their flashlights swept the dark interior, at first revealing only neatly stacked boxes. It looked like a normal shipment, until a beam of light caught scratch marks on the back wall. "Something's wrong there," Teresa pointed out. "That wall doesn't look right." Rex moved forward decisively, sniffing intensely and scratching at a side panel, ignoring the commands to stay back. The dog knew. The moment he had waited for nearly 2 weeks, had finally arrived. Removing several boxes revealed a structure that didn't belong. A false wall, carefully camouflaged. Daniel's heart raced as they noticed a small, makeshift door. Careful, Teresa warned. It could be booby-trapped. When they finally managed to open the secret compartment, the horror was revealed in the flashlight beams. 5 children were huddled in the tiny space, clinging to one another. The little ones, between 5 and 10 years old, showed clear signs of dehydration and malnutrition. Their wide, terrified eyes blinked against the sudden light. The smell of mold mingled with sweat and urine. A bucket in the corner served as a makeshift toilet. Empty water bottles and biscuit wrappers spoke of their scarce provisions. One of the children was sobbing silently, as if she had learned that making noise brought consequences. Rex was the first to approach, his steps cautious. To everyone's surprise, the children showed no fear of the animal. A little girl with dark hair stretched out a trembling hand toward the dog. "He was outside," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "We heard him scratching. We knew we weren't alone." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. As the medical team was urgently called, he knelt before the children. "You're safe now," he assured them, his voice thick with emotion. Sergeant Rivas, visibly shaken, coordinated the securing of the area over her radio. Teresa was already photographing everything, documenting every detail. Seotonico, watching from a distance, just shook his head. "I knew something was wrong. That dog. He knew all along." As the children were carefully carried out of the container, it was clear that their nightmare was over. But the scars would remain, as would the certainty that without Rex's persistence, their fate would have been very different. The news of the rescue spread through the Port of Santos like wildfire. The case made national headlines, with photographs of Rex beside the container on every front page. Daniel, once the target of suspicious looks and sarcastic comments, was now hailed as a hero. He deflected the praise, insisting that without the German shepherd's determination, the investigation would have gone nowhere. Sergeant Rivas publicly acknowledged her subordinate's merit. "Officer Brotas demonstrated exceptional sensitivity and persistence," she stated at a press conference. "His work exemplifies what it truly means to protect and serve." The families of the rescued children, who had come from poor communities in the north, arrived in the following days. Their emotional reunion was broadcast live, deepening the nation's connection to the story. The operation at the port had uncovered more than just 5 children. In the following week, a human trafficking network that had operated for at least 7 years was dismantled. 17 people were arrested, including port administrators and customs officials. But Daniel faced consequences for ignoring the chain of command. An internal inquiry was launched to investigate his conduct. For 2 weeks, he was suspended from duty, fearing for the career he loved. "I'd do it all again," he confessed to Sergeant Rivas. She, along with Teresa Vale, became his staunchest defenders. But the tide truly turned with the testimony from the rescued children's families. One mother embraced Daniel outside the hearing, whispering, "My son is alive because of you and that blessed dog." The immense public and media pressure worked in his favor. The reports highlighted how the port, despite its technology, had security gaps exploited by criminals. In the end, Daniel's instinct and Rex's loyalty had not only saved 5 lives, but had forced an entire community to look more closely into its own dark corners. After the children were rescued and the investigation began, Rex vanished from the Port of Santos without a trace. Daniel Brotas spent days searching for the German Shepherd, combing every corner of the docks, asking longshoremen and security guards if anyone had seen the animal. No one knew anything. He was probably picked up by an animal welfare group, Sergeant Rivas commented, trying to console the officer during a coffee break. After all that media exposure, some organization must have taken an interest in him. Daniel just shook his head, unconvinced. He knew the dog's temperament and doubted anyone could have captured him so easily. Tonico, the old port worker, who had been observing the conversation from a distance, approached with a slight limp. "That animal is not just any dog, son," the old man said, leaning on his cane. "I've seen many dogs here in my 40 years at the port, but never one like him. He didn't stay because of the container or the children. He stayed because he chose to." Teresa Valle, now working closely with Daniel on the human trafficking investigation, suggested putting up posters around the city. Daniel even printed a few with the photo he had taken of Rex, but something inside him told him it was useless. At night, sitting on his porch with a cold cup of coffee, Daniel reflected on the events of the past weeks. The rescued children were receiving psychological care and were slowly being reunited with their families. The criminals, including the port employees involved in the scheme, were being prosecuted. His own once stagnant career was gaining new momentum, but Rex's absence left an inexplicable void. Maybe it's for the best, he thought, looking up at the stars. He completed his mission. At the station, his colleagues stopped asking about the dog, sensing how the subject affected Daniel. Only Sergeant Rivas once remarked that perhaps Rex had moved on to another place where he was needed. "Not all heroes stay for the medals," she said, in a rare moment of sensitivity. Daniel silently agreed. For him, the animal's absence was a constant reminder that true protectors need no recognition or reward. They simply answer a call from their own hearts, appearing when needed and departing when their work is done. As the city of Santos returned to normal, and the case began to fade from the headlines, the officer stored the collar he had bought for Rex in a drawer, not as a final goodbye, but as one might keep a symbol of hope for better days. A week had passed since the rescue. Daniel was trying to get back to his routine, but the images of the children in the container still haunted him. That Sunday morning, a relentless rain beat against the windows of his home. He was making coffee when the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting visitors in such a storm. When he opened the gate, his heart hammered in his chest. Soaked by the rain, his dark fur matted to his body, Rex stared back at him from the porch. The German Shepherd had the same determined gaze Daniel had first seen at the port, but now there was a serenity that hadn't been there before. "How did you find me, old friend?" Daniel murmured, kneeling on the wet porch. The dog remained still for a few seconds, as if assessing the situation. Teresa Valle had mentioned that an animal rescue group had tried to take Rex in, but he had disappeared on the first night. Tonico, with his old docker's wisdom, had told Daniel, "That animal isn't just any animal. He chooses where he wants to be." Without further hesitation, Daniel opened his arms. Rex approached cautiously, allowing the man to touch his wet fur. When the officer embraced him, he felt the animal's body relax completely for the first time. "You're home now," he whispered as the rain continued to fall. Inside, Daniel dried his new companion with a towel and prepared a plate of leftover chicken. He watched as Rex ate calmly, without the usual voracity of a stray. It was as if he knew he no longer had to worry about his next meal. Later that afternoon, as the storm subsided, a message arrived from Sergeant Rivas. Heard your four-legged partner found you. He deserves a medal as much as you do. Daniel smiled, watching Rex sleep soundly on the living room rug. Here, far from the chaos of the port, the rusted containers, and the constant danger, the dog finally seemed at peace. His mission was complete. Now, he could simply be a dog with a home. 6 months later, a small plaza was inaugurated on the exact spot where container BZXU4179 had stood for so many days. The late afternoon sun bathed the new space, transforming what was once a forgotten corner of the docks into a symbol of hope. A gleaming bronze plaque read, "To those who did not see but felt, and to the dog that never gave up." The public prosecutor's office had demanded a complete overhaul of port security protocols across the country. In the end, Daniel was not only acquitted, but also awarded a medal for his service to the community. On the day of his ceremony, Rex was by his side, wearing a new collar, officially recognized as a fundamental part of the story that forever changed the routine of the largest port in Latin America. Tonico, the old port worker who had first alerted Daniel, had smiled discreetly when he heard the news. "Some things you know, but you can't prove," he'd commented while watching new scanners being installed at the main gates. It took a dog to show what many people pretended not to see. Now, at the plaza dedication, Sergeant Rivas, one of Daniel's staunchest defenders, led the ceremony. "Today, we celebrate not just courage," she said, glancing meaningfully at the German shepherd, "but the sensitivity to perceive what our eyes do not always see." The most emotional moment came when the 5 rescued children arrived with their families. Dressed in bright colors that contrasted sharply with the memories of the dark compartment, they ran directly to Rex. One of the girls, the youngest of the group, knelt and hugged the animal, whispering words that only the two of them seemed to understand. Later that evening, Daniel and Rex walked through the quiet plaza. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange that reflected on the calm water. He saw 2 of the rescued children playing in the distance, their laughter echoing in a space that silence had once almost consumed. Rex stood alert at his side. Daniel stroked his friend's head. "You know, boy," he murmured, "you changed a lot of lives." Tonico appeared, walking slowly along the promenade. He waved from a distance and then sat down beside them. "It's a good thing someone finally listened to what this dog had to say," the old man remarked. "Some people go their whole lives without paying attention to the signs." Looking out at the horizon, where cargo ships followed their routes as they always had, Daniel felt a profound sense of peace. The port continued its relentless rhythm, but something had changed forever. Amid the containers and cranes, there was now a silent reminder that, even in the face of humanity's worst horrors, one must never ignore an instinct or the gaze of a dog who refuses to leave his post.